Hi, this is Dr. Rusty Jones, and welcome back to Viral Shakespeare. This episode, I'm taking on the end of Act 1 of King Lear and hopefully all of Act 2 of King Lear. And for a theme to start off this particular lecture, I'm picking up actually in Act 3 of Lear, but I want to kind of backtrack on this as a way to talk about genre for a second. So I've pulled out this quote here, and this is Lear from Act 3. Scene 2, I am a man more sinned against than sinning. I said that badly. Let me say it again. I am a man more sinned against than sinning. And by this point, the audience is left to answer that question with a resounding, yeah, but are you really? That question, that sort of tone-deaf question from Lear himself, harkens right back to something that one of his daughters says early in the play. I believe it's Regan from Act 1, Scene 1, who says, "Yet he hath ever but slenderly known himself." Act 1, Scene 1. And that seems to be the case. That Lear has never actually had to face up to who he is as a king, who he is as a father, who he is as a human being, and all of the faults therein. But by the time we reach the storm in Act 3, and everything begins to disintegrate, and the man is being very literally stripped down to his essence, he is forced to face exactly who he is. This is, in essence, one of the reasons why I feel that King Lear is probably Shakespeare's best tragedy. This is my opinion, but probably his best tragedy, probably his most effective tragedy, because Lear coming to the realization of who he is and admitting to who he is a perfect example of someone late in the stages of their life who finally comes to the admission of, this is what I am and this is what I have done wrong. It's a point where all of us hope to get at some point, where we have a kind of an honest assessment of who we are. Where it becomes a tragedy, especially for Lear, is that all of this awareness, all of this recognition comes too late, and that's what makes it tragedy. This is Lear's kind of late admission of who he is. This understanding and this recognition of who he is a prime example of the Aristotelian tragic notion of anagnorisis. And if I read a definition off of my other screen over here, anagnorisis in Aristotelian tragedy is a moment in the plot wherein the main character either recognizes or identifies his or her true nature, recognizes the other character's true identity, and discovers what their role is in the tragedy itself as it has unfolded. I often call it an aha or a recognition moment of, oh, I see, this is my fault. This is a recognition of who I am and the mistakes that I've made. And what makes it tragic is not that you have this realization, is that these realizations come too late. With Lear, you get this in a much more kind of stark and startling way than you do in some of Shakespeare's other tragedies that are perhaps a little bit more, oh, I don't know, argued as being superior to Lear just maybe because they're more familiar than Lear. For example, Romeo and Juliet. I don't think Romeo ever has an anagnorisis moment. I mean, he goes around screaming, I am fortune's fool, and okay, yeah, maybe you are. The friar got locked in a plague house, didn't get the letter to Romeo that the whole thing was a setup and Juliet, in fact, wasn't dead. Maybe this is fortune stepping in, but he never acknowledges any part of his role in this. Hamlet, another example of this. I've got a copy of Hamlet here, and I thought I would read from late in the play, Act 5, Scene 2, about line 204, where Hamlet says to Laertes right before they have their duel, their battle at the end of the play, "Give me your pardon, sir, I have done you wrong. But pardon it, as you are a gentleman. This presence knows, and you must needs have heard, how I am punished with a sore distraction. What I have done, that might your nature, honor, and exception roughly awake, I here proclaim was madness." Well, that's a very convenient kind of out in my book. Hamlet blames his mother for being incestuous, blames Claudius for being a monster. never really acknowledges what he has done to Ophelia, whether he had good intentions behind it or not. It doesn't really feel like an anagnorisis to me. It kind of feels like an excuse. Lear has that moment. And what's amazing about it is it comes out of the mouth and out of the brain of such an old man in such a dire situation that the whole thing is way too late. And that's the thing that's really heartbreaking. He has slenderly known himself up to a point, and the point that he does, we're past the point of no return. And that's what's truly heartbreaking about this play and what makes it so amazingly tragic. Okay, with that in mind, I wanted to start in Act 1, Scene 2. Just wanted to touch on a couple more points with regard to Edmund, the, quote, evil bastard of Gloucester, as he has passed the letter on to Gloucester, framing his brother Edgar for plotting against his father, which Edgar, of course, wasn't doing, and Gloucester not blaming the right people. Again, a little like Lear, who doesn't put the blame where it needs to be on himself until fairly late in the play. Gloucester also doesn't put the blame where it needs to be. He's been very insensitive to Edmund in the first scene of Act 1, and then after he finds out that his own legitimate son is, quote unquote, trying to overthrow him, Gloucester says at line 101, Act 1, Scene 2, "These late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good to us. Though the wisdom of nature can reason it thus and thus, yet nature finds itself scourged by the sequent effects. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide. In cities, mutiny." And he goes on from there. And he's basically blaming the heavens for this. He's blaming, astrology for this. He's blaming the sun and moon and eclipses and all of these sort of superstitious portents. And once he leaves, Edmund laughs at him and says, "This is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, when we are unlucky, often the surfeits of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion." And again, yes, he's a villainous character, but he's got a point. The same point that Lear is going to have to come to at some point. The same point that I would argue, I guess, that Gloucester comes to once we find out near the end that he died with his heart bursting smilingly, that he kind of recognizes the problems that he himself has created in life. Edmund says, these are our problems. It's no good to blame the sun and the moon when we are fools on our own compulsion. We do it on our, by ourselves. Villain or not, he's, again, got a good point. He made good points earlier about the assumption that someone who is a bastard is by nature base in their personality. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. He certainly bears out that maybe they are, and yet he still brings up a good point. This is just a convention of nature, almost a superstition, as he raises it there. Okay, jumping forward. Act 1, Scene 3 at the very beginning. This is page 159 if you're in the same textbook that I am in. And Goneril, who is anticipating Lear's arrival with his 100 knights, way too much of a burden on his child, way too much to ask. Remember, he also said, "You're going to entertain me, you're going to pay for everything, and I get to keep the name and addition of a king. But I want you to do all of the work. Have your cake and eat it too. It's impossible. I'm going to call you king, you're going to be king. If you're not king, you're not king, and I don't have to call you that." Again, I think it might be a little unfair to label Goneril and Regan as being terrible people. How much of this has been laid on them by Daddy and Daddy's excesses? If this kind of thing interests you, you might want to pick up a book called 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley. Smiley takes on this whole question of how much responsibility is in the daughter's nature, how much of it is laid on them by the evils of their father. It's a really interesting modern retelling of King Lear, so check it out. Goneril says right off the bat, "Did my father strike my gentleman for chiding of his fool?" There is so much subtext there that we have to take apart for a second there. Did my father strike my gentleman for chiding of his fool? In other words, did my father really strike one of my people when one of my people let his fool, Lear's fool, which we'll talk about in a second, let him have it? Did my father really do this? Did he degrade a member of my household? Did he strike them? Is he acting like this sort of tyrant who can do whatever he wants in my household? Just because one of my people yelled at his fool? It suggests that Lear still wants to be in charge of everything, still wants everybody to bow down to him, can get away with absolutely anything he wants, despite the fact that he has given up everything to his daughters, yet he also wants to maintain everything. It's impossible. It's an untenable situation for his daughters. Oswald says, "Aye, madam." Yes, in fact, he did do that. Skipping forward. Kent comes in disguised into Goneril's household, disguised as Caius, as we're going to hear later, because remember, he's been banished for speaking out against Lear. And he actually offers Lear service. After about line 20 on page 161, Lear says, "What wouldst thou?" to Kent, and Kent says, "Service." "Who wouldst thou serve?" says Lear, and the answer is you. I want to serve you. "Dost thou know me, fellow?" And Kent says, "No, sir. But you have that in your countenance which I would fain call master." "What's that?" asked Lear. "Authority." This goes back to the idea that kings and queens cannot be granted authority. God gives them their authority. They have a divine authority to sit on that throne, and there's nothing you can do to wipe it away. Lear makes that mistake. He tries to, in some ways, maintain some of his divine authority and give other aspects of his divine authority away. That's not possible. You cannot do that. So Kent tries to remind him of the fact that he does have that divine authority and nothing can give it away. And so Kent is going to continue to act as his servant. Okay, just wanted to touch on that moment. Skipping ahead a little bit here. Oswald is called upon on page 163 by Lear at about line 84 or so. And when Oswald enters, Lear asks him directly, because his daughter has not given him all the obsequious behavior that he desires, "Who am I, sir?" "My lady's father," answers Oswald. Ooh, that's a slap. I'm not going to call you king. I'm going to call you exactly what you've reduced yourself to, my lady's father. Not first banana, a much lower banana than that. My lady's father. My lady's father, my lord's knave, you horse and dog, you slave, you cur. I am none of these, my lord, I beseech your pardon. So Lear continues to act in a very sort of violent and tyrannical way when he himself has set that situation up. Okay. Now comes a character in Act 1, Scene 4, page 164, that I want to go through fairly quickly here, but he's a tremendously important character, and that's the fool. Please don't get fools and clowns confused in Shakespeare. A clown is a comedic figure, a sort of a rustic country bumpkin, whose job is basically to make people laugh. A fool is a job. A fool is a jester. A fool is someone who is employed by a royal household, by a noble household, to entertain. And traditionally, part of that entertainment is to speak truth to power. But there are limits, and the fool is constantly reminded of that by Lear, just as it would have happened in real life. Step too far outside of the bounds of respect for the divine authority, and you will get slapped down, literally. So the fool comes in at about line 96 or so, as Lear is giving Kent money and says, "Let me hire him too. Here's my coxcomb." The coxcomb is the fool's hat. "Lear, how now, my pretty knave, how dost thou?" "Sirrah, you were best to take my coxcomb." "Why, my boy?" says Lear. "Why, for taking one's part that's out of favor," says the fool. "Nay, and thou canst not smile as the wind sits, thou catch cold shortly." "There," he says to Kent, "take my coxcomb." "Why, this fellow," meaning Lear, "has banished 2 of his daughters, and did the 3rd a blessing against his will. If thou follow him," he says to Kent, "thou must needs wear my coxcomb." "How now, nuncle?" I don't know why he calls him nuncle. I always think maybe it's a compression of mine uncle. It also sounds a bit like an insult. "How now, nuncle? Would I had 2 coxcombs and 2 daughters." "Why, my boy," asked Lear, "if I gave them all my living, I'd keep my coxcombs myself." "There's mine," and he hands over the coxcomb. "Beg another of thy daughters." Well, he doesn't say your daughters, by the way, which would have been the respectful form of you. He says thy daughters, which is an insult. And an even bigger insult is to say, "Oh, you need something, Lear? Why don't you beg it of your daughters? You've given them everything. You've taken everything away from yourself. You've made yourself a beggar and an idiot in your own country. Why don't you beg something of your daughters?" A very dangerous thing to do. And Lear responds in kind. "Take heed, sirrah, the whip." I'll whip you if you keep this up. The fool then offers him a song with some very good advice about temperance. Line 116 or so. "Have more than thou showest," says the fool. "Speak less than thou knowest." Have more than you display. Speak less than you understand. Lend less than thou owest. don't lend things out. Ride more than thou goest, learn more than thou trowest, set less than thou throwest, leave thy drink, stop drinking, and thy whore, and keep in a door, and thou shalt have more than 2 tens to a score. It reminds me often of Polonius's advice to Laertes in Hamlet, but that comes from Polonius, a goofball and an idiot who doesn't follow his own advice and never has. Here, from the Fool, this is good, sound moral advice. He's one of the moral advisors to the king, along with Cordelia and along with Kent. And these are the fools, exiles, outcasts, etc., who have tasked themselves to follow Lear around and act as kind of moral guides as he begins to move toward this anagnorisis, this kind of recognition that comes too late. This is nothing, fool, says Kent, and the fool says, well, guess what? It's great because you gave me nothing for it, so if it's nothing, that works out just fine. And then we get back to nothing, an echo from Act 1. Can you make no use of nothing, nuncle? Why, no, boy, nothing can be made out of nothing. And he still doesn't realize the fact that nothingness, like the creation of the universe, can be made out of pure will. You can make something out of nothing, but he still doesn't understand that. Lear is going to literally have to be reduced to nothing before he can understand that he himself is capable of making something out of nothing, but it's too late by the end of the play. So that's an echo earlier. The Fool goes on to talk about eggs and how if he splits an egg, he can give Lear 2 crowns, the 2 crowns of the egg. But then the line I really want to pay attention to before I move on is line 153, where Lear says, when were you so wont to be so full of song, sirrah? When were you the last time you sang so much? And the Fool says, I have used it, nuncle, ever since thou madest thy daughters thy mothers. For when thou gavest them the rod, the thing you use to beat children with, for when thou gavest them the rod and puttest down thine own breeches, in other words, well, you've reversed the order of nature, Lear. You have turned your daughters into mom, and not only that, you gave them the rod for them to beat you with. So good job there. It reminds me of when Lear says of Cordelia, I really wanted to I had my hopes set on Cordelia's kind nursery. I wanted her to be mommy. I wanted to be the baby in my old age. It may be the way that life works, but it's still a reversal of nature, and it is in its own way unnatural. And the Fool is directly pointing this out. Goneril comes in, talks about how the Fool has been running around saying really terrible things, and I wanted to pay attention here, before we end Act 1, to page 170, where Lear does a terrible thing. Out of anger for Goneril not bowing down to him and doing absolutely everything he wanted to do, and pointing out the fact that he's been acting like a spoiled child and bringing his 100 knights and his fool rioting around the castle, he pleads again. He pleads to nature, which is nature as a figure we've heard before, and to nature as a goddess, he says of his own daughter, into her womb, line 260, Act 1, Scene 4, into her womb convey sterility, dry up in her the organs of increase, and from her derogate body never spring a babe to honor her. And he goes on later to say a fairly famous line. He wants her to feel how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. But I think we in the audience again should go, well, thank you for what? Cordelia said early, I thank you for, breeding me and educating me and all the rest of that. I honor you for all those things like a good daughter should. What more do you want from me? Well, Goneril, what else does she want? Yeah, you gave me money and you gave me titles, but you're also taking my money and you're not obeying me like I have a title. So thank you for what? But to damn her to sterility is also to damn himself, because children, in Shakespeare's view, are kind of the way that you move your family line and the way that you move your fame into the future. Well, you curse your child with sterility, you curse yourself and your family to oblivion, and that's essentially what Lear is doing in his anger and his stupidity. Leaping forward here, time-wise, I'm going to jump way forward to Act 2, Scene 3, so forgive me for that. Checking the time, I've got about 10 minutes left. Edgar enters. Remember, he is being chased down by Gloucester's men as a supposed traitor to his father. And Edgar says, I heard myself proclaimed, and by the happy hollow of a tree escaped the hunt. No port is free, no place that guard, and most unusual vigilance does not attend my taking. Whilst I may escape, I will I will preserve myself and am bethought to take the basest and most poorest shape that ever penury and contempt of man brought near to beast. In other words, I got to disguise myself as a poor and crazy man, which is exactly what he does. My face I'll grime with filth, blanket my loins, elf all my hair in knots, and with my presented nakedness outface the winds and persecutions of the sky. So I'm going to make myself look like a crazy, dirty lunatic. The country gives me proof and precedent of Bedlam, Bedlam is the lunatic asylum at the time, of Bedlam beggars who with roaring voices strike in their numbed and mortified arms, pins, wooden pricks, nails, sprigs of rosemary, and with this horrible object from low farms, poor pelting villages, sheepcotes and mills, sometimes with lunatic bands, sometime with prayers, enforce their charity. So in other words, I'm going to disguise myself as a bedlam lunatic beggar who basically, between shouting out crazy things and sometimes shouting out prayers, begs money and basically plagues the entire town. No one will notice me, in essence, because we live in a crazy time, populated by crazy people. This is actually hiding in plain sight because the country is so backwards and so unnatural, nobody will notice one more crazy beggar. And he will disguise himself as a character named Poor Tom, which he does. And then he says at line 21, Edgar, I nothing am, which is a wonderful kind of Yoda thing right there. Edgar, I am nothing, basically. But Edgar, I nothing am. And putting that am at the end, I quite love that. He basically erases himself. I am no longer Edgar. I take that identity away because it was taken away from me by my father. He doesn't know that Edmund is plotting this whole thing. And he erases himself and he creates Poor Tom, who fits perfectly into this lunatic universe that Lear himself has set in motion. Kent is put in the stocks in Act 2, Scene 4, leg irons basically, for arguing on behalf of Lear himself. And as Lear finds out that his faithful servant Caius, who is actually Kent, of course, in disguise, has been put into the stocks, he gets angrier and angrier. And then he says something that I think is interesting. Page 191, Act 2, Scene 4, line 48. Oh, how this mother swells up toward my heart. Hysterica passio, down thou climbing sorrow, thy elements below. Where is this daughter, the one who stalked Kent? That's really important, and I want you all to pay attention to it, even the folks who aren't in my class and are just watching on YouTube. He calls the mother, or he identifies the mother swelling up toward his heart, and then he says hysterica passio, the hysteric in me, down, down, down. And I've talked about this before, but hysteria, also known as the mother in Shakespeare's day, was a very specific biological ailment that women suffered, supposedly, where the womb wanders all around the body, casting the humors into imbalance, and then women become hysterical. He wants hysterica passio. He wants it down. He's worried that the mother is swelling up in him. The cure for hysteria in Shakespeare's day, invented by males, of course, is to get the woman married and get her pregnant, preferably in that order. And that will calm that wandering womb right down. It was also called the wandering womb, by the way. It's interesting that this is what Lear is afraid of, that because his daughters are overthrowing him, that they're basically emasculating him. He's becoming a woman, and that woman's disease of hysteria is starting to rise in him, and he is trying to push it down. He is terrified of this kind of emasculation, and it's just going to get worse. There's an article that my class is going to read about this, but basically it's really important to recognize this. Later he's going to say that he's very concerned about women's weapons, water drops, tears coming out of his eyes. This idea of emasculation, of in some way giving way to the feminine or being overthrown by the feminine, terrifies him up until his anagnorisis, when it no longer does. Okay, jumping forward again. Line 92 or so on page 193, Lear is basically, he's been demanding to speak with the Duke of Cornwall and Regan. He's been screaming and yelling about this, and they have not been, racing to him and saying their apologies and kissing butt, etc. The king, he says at the top of page 193, Act 2, Scene 4, the king would speak with Cornwall. The dear father would with his daughter speak. Commands, tend service. Are they informed of this? My breath and blood, fiery, the fiery duke, tell the hot duke that... No, but not yet. Maybe he is not well. Infirmity doth still neglect all office, whereto our health is bound. It's an excuse. No one's going to obey you anymore, and you yourself have done this. It's no good yelling at people when you've given them the power and you've taken it away from yourself. You can make all the excuses you want about Cornwall being sick. It doesn't matter. He doesn't have to come to you anymore and pay obeisance, and that's basically your fault. Okay, jumping forward again. Page 195. Regan is also cursed. Act 2, Scene 4, about line 156 or so. Nimble lightnings dart your blinding flames into her scornful eyes, infect her beauty, you fen-sucked fogs drawn by the powerful sun to fall and blister. Again, cursing your own children, one of the worst things that this bad father could possibly do. Jumping forward again. Act 2, Scene 4. Still. Page 200, about line 254, Goneril says, "What need you 25 men? Why do you have to have 100 men? Why do you even need 25 men? Or 10? Or 5? And Regan says, "What need one?" Now that's a little bit cruel, sure, for a man who's used to being king and father and all the rest of this stuff, and yet they got a point. You're not king anymore. Why do you have to have a retinue follow you around? And Lear's response is thematically interesting. Oh, reason, not the need. Don't ask why I need it. Our basest beggars are in the poorest thing superfluous. Our basest beggars have everything that they need. It's not a question of need. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is as cheap as beasts. If you don't give man, who is separate from beast, more than they actually need, then they are the same as beasts. So what's the point? Thou art a lady, he says as an example here. If only to go warm were gorgeous, why nature needs not what thou gorgeous wearest, which scarcely keeps thee warm. In other words, look, if clothing is just all about warmth, fine, you only need what keeps you warm, but you're a lady, you're above a beast, and your clothes don't even keep you warm. They are a sign that you have more than you need. You are more than that. He's still clinging to this idea that we have to have more than what we naturally are to be something important, to be something influential in life. He doesn't understand that at our deep core, we're all basically the same. Not that we're animals, but that we all have the same basic nature. You're a lady. You wear these fancy clothes that don't even keep you warm. You don't need that, but you got that because you're a lady. He doesn't get it yet, that we're all basically, when you boil it down, the same. But for true need, you heavens, give me that patience, patience I need. You see me here, you gods, a poor old man, as full of grief as age, wretched in both. Yeah, but that's just crying for sympathy. It's not till later in the play when he's going to say, I am a foolish, fond old man, and mean it, and understand it. Here it's just sort of self-pity. If it be you that stirs these daughters' hearts against their father, fool me not so much to bear it tamely. Touch me with noble anger, that would be masculine anger, and let not women's weapons, water drops, stain my man's cheeks. Know you unnatural hags, I will have such revenges on you both, that the world shall. I will do such things. What they are, yet I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth. You think I'll weep. No, I'll not weep. I have full cause of weeping, but this heart, and then the storm breaks. I think that that's fascinating right there. He's so, again, terrified of the female nature in him, stereotypically something more compassionate, something more empathetic, more understanding, more gentle, more kind. He's so terrified that this will overcome him. He wants noble anger. He is so impotent, though, that he swears he'll have revenge, but he has absolutely no idea what that will be. And then when the storm breaks, again, this is not my reading, this is a pretty general reading, it's metaphorically exemplary of the madness finally breaking in Lear that he has to go through before he can have that anagnorisis, that kind of recognition of what he actually is. Just a minute or so left. Let me see what else I've got here. That takes me all the way to Act 3, where the storm actually breaks. So this is where I will stop. I hope you have enjoyed this romp through the end of Act 1 and into Act 2. And stay safe. And remember, I'm thinking about you.